So this is our chapter 3 lecture. In chapter 2, we discussed federalism and looked at the United States Constitution in quite a bit of depth because the powers that are granted to states are listed in and directed by the United States Constitution. This chapter discusses the Constitution of Texas, and it does it in an interesting way. So first, we're going to talk about the fact that Texas has had several constitutions. And so we will discuss those constitutions and then discuss the last one that Texas had, which was in 1875. Now, in contrast, the United States Constitution was originally adopted in the late 1700s, and that is the only constitution that we've had. We will, it has been amended 27 times. Texas's constitution has been amended almost 2,000. So, then we'll look at the Constitution itself. The Texas Constitution is not something that you would see every day or that you probably ever have seen. So we'll talk about how it is set up and we'll compare it a little bit to the United States Constitution. We will talk about how the Texas Constitution gets amended, and then that is where we will end. We won't do the apply what you've learned in this lecture, not to say that you shouldn't read it when you read the book. So the book starts with the Constitution of the Republic of Texas that was adopted in 1836, and it was immediately after Texas received independence from Mexico after the war that was discussed in detail in assignment 1. But there was a constitution prior to this constitution. One of the issues that Texans were so upset about, that there were several, slavery and thinking that they were going to have those rights taken away, were among them. But one of the issues that they had was that they did not feel as if Texas was being recognized. Mexico never fully trusted Texans. It was too far. There were too many people coming from other countries. There were too many Anglos. And so they never really trusted Texas. And so when they got ready to form their provisional provinces, they combined Texas with the state of Coahuila, or the province of Coahuila at the time. And they actually called it Coahuila y Tejas. And Stephen F. Austin actually went to Mexico City to try to plead the case of Texas. They just wanted some separate recognition, some separate representation. They did not want to be combined with Coahuila. So that was really the first constitution of the state of Texas. I don't know. I know one governor's name. His name was Felix Tres Palacios. I can't remember his middle name. But it was a big surprise to many that Texas did prevail, and prevail so quickly, in the war with Mexico. They were certainly not the only Mexican outpost that was in war with Mexico, and maybe that was part of the problem. But that war literally lasted 7 months. And so they were not prepared. Let's be honest. They were not prepared. A lot of people wanted to see about just becoming a state in the United States, but United States wasn't looking for a slave state right then. So that was roundly rejected. So really, they took the United States Constitution. They went to a place in southeast Texas, kind of near Nacogdoches today. They called the place the Washington on the Brazos. It is still called Washington on the Brazos. My uncle is buried there because his wife was from that area. Washington on the Brazos. And they sat down and banged out a constitution because they were going to have to become a country. So they had the Republic of Texas Constitution. Some of the things that they wrote into that constitution. They said that the president is term limited, meaning that the president's term would be 3 years. The first president would have a 2-year term. You could not serve consecutive terms. First president of the Republic of Texas was Sam Houston. If you have ever driven down Highway 6 and driven through Huntsville, you will see that huge, I don't know how many feet, statue of Sam Houston. And recently there have been some protests and people were saying that he was prejudiced and that, but there is no way to separate Texas history from Sam Houston. He presided over, or was actually the commander of the army that won the final battle, if we want to call it that, at San Jacinto. Sorry, that I'm Texasing that up, San Jacinto. And he was the first president of the Republic of Texas. He was also the third president of the Republic of Texas. So 3-year terms. First term was 2 years, couldn't serve consecutive terms. They put in there explicitly that there was going to be separation of church and state. In fact, if you were a member of the clergy, if you were a person of the cloth, a priest, a preacher, you could not serve in office. Those were the specific words that were written into there. There were a lot of Spanish and Mexican provisions. There were also some English provisions. Well, let me give you some examples of the Spanish provisions. And the Mexico had pretty much adopted these, and Texas took these on since they were going to be an independent country. So one of them was homesteads. We still have homestead laws in Texas. You cannot be kicked out of property that you claim as your primary residence, where you live, unless you like have a lien and you didn't pay it. You really give up some of your rights. So like a mortgage company can eventually evict you, but we have and that was, if you really think about it, that was very necessary because people were coming from all over and they were living on land that hadn't been granted to them. And so this was one way, the Spanish law was one way to establish property rights without to establish property rights without having to go and adjudicate something. You claim something as your homestead, it's yours for all practical purposes, and nobody's going to be able to come and kick you off of it. There are some other community property states, Florida, which had a very heavy Spanish influence, California, Louisiana, are all have homestead laws, and another very Spanish provision is the concept of community property. Community property. So community property basically says that two people in a marriage jointly own all of the property that is acquired during the marriage. Doesn't matter who made it. Doesn't matter who was working. If you are married, then all the income that comes in is jointly owned. Now, of course, the law said that if a couple was married, that the man had control of the property, but if there was ever a dissolution of the marriage, or if someone passed away, Texas was a community property state, and so were those other Spanish provinces like Spain and California and Oregon and Louisiana as well. They adopted, and this is really English law, this concept called common law. And what common law is, the simple definition is judge-made law. Basically, law by tradition and not necessarily written down in a book, in a law book. So this really came from England, and not all countries are common law, but certainly in the United States and in the Republic of Texas, if a court made a decision, then we treat that like it is law. If there are customs that that get established, then we treat those like they are law. Have you ever heard the term common law marriage? What that means is that you didn't have a formal ceremony. You didn't go and get a marriage license, but if you live together and hold yourself out to the public as man and wife, then we are going to treat that union as if it is like it was performed with a license. You have to get a divorce, the whole 9 yards. And so the beginning of those proceedings are just about proving that you were married and that you held yourself out, that he called you his wife at a party, or you signed into a hotel as Mr. and Mrs. Smith. The last thing that we'll talk about in this Constitution is the fact that the government that was formed was a unitary form of government. Now, you know the word uni means one, meaning that there was only one branch of government, and the Republic of Texas did everything. They granted city charters. So there were several cities that were chartered under the Republic of Texas. There were no state units. There were counties and there were cities, and everything was run centrally. Now, we love to say in Texas that we are the only state that used to be a country. And it is absolutely true that of the states that have been allowed into the Union, the 50, Texas is the only one that was an independent nation. We did it for 9 years. We did not do it well. So we can brag all we want to, but that period of time was marked by not very well organized military attacks from Native American tribes that were still trying to figure out what Spain, Mexico, or Texas was doing on their property. Mexico attacked because they still didn't believe that this had happened to them. They never were able to fully stabilize their currency because they had to create and print currency. The judicial system was difficult to manage. So most of the time, many times, people would just settle disputes their own way. And even when they would get to the courthouse, there were lots of stories about gunfights at the courthouse. So Texas did not master the art of being an independent nation. And to be honest with you, on several occasions, they approached the United States and were like, hey, what about now? What about now? And eventually the United States said, sure, okay, why not? So in 1845, Texas was admitted to the United States as a state. And they were immediately, federal troops were dispatched to help defend, and they helped to settle parts of West Texas because of their military might. So they got rid of their currency because remember the United States Constitution says you can't coin your own money. They got rid of their military and had a new constitution in 1845. Some significant provisions in that constitution when Texas became a part of the United States of America, they restricted the power of the legislature. They put in there some things that the legislature had to do and some things that the legislature couldn't do. State debt was limited to $100,000. Could not borrow more than $100,000 now. I don't know how much that is in today's dollars, but they put a limit on the amount of debt that the state could carry. They established a permanent school fund. So they decided that there would be financial support for public schools that would come from the state of Texas. And one of the ways that they funded that was through the permanent school fund. So when income would come in, some of it would be set aside specifically for schools. I'm not exactly sure why, but this was the long ballot was definitely a part of the state of Texas. There were lots of offices that people needed to be elected to. Elections were held pretty uniformly, and they would put all the people on the state level and the county level on one ballot. We kind of still do this today. You go and look at a ballot during presidential years or midterm years. There are so many names. There's no way to know who all those people are. But they decided that they were going to make voting for offices pretty uniform so that they could have elections all at one time. Long ballot. So Texas was clicking right along. And of course, it was admitted to the Union as a slave state. In 1861, Texas decided that it was going to join the Confederate States of America. So, along with South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, Texas decided to secede. So they had to have a new constitution. If they were no longer part of the United States of America, they were part of the Confederate States of America. So they acknowledged that they were a Confederate state. They put some provisions into that constitution that said that you could not free your slaves without getting permission from a state official. And I don't want to belabor the point, but I do just want to say that when Texas decided to secede, they signed a document that is called the Declaration of Causes. Let me see if I can pull that up for you. So here is a copy of the Texas Declaration of Causes. This was ratified February 2nd, 1861, and it was giving the list of reasons why Texas was seceding from the federal union. It's a very interesting document. One of the things that they said was, and let's see if we can find it quickly. The United States government was not supporting Texas in maintaining and protecting the institution known as Negro slavery. The servitude of the African to the white race within her limits. And they go on to say that Negro slavery is, let me see if I can find it, divine. And that it is benevolent and patriarchal. And that if the United States government was not going to support Texas in its pursuit of remaining a slave holding state, then Texas had to leave. Now, they also said that they had sent people to burn down towns, poison slaves. They have impoverished slaveholding states. They refused to vote appropriations for protecting Texas against ruthless savages. So they also said that they were not protecting them from Native American attacks, and they said they were doing that because Texas was a slaveholding state. So I have heard people argue that the Civil War was not about slavery, that it was about states' rights. Well, maybe it was about states' rights to own slaves, but for Texas, very explicitly, it was about slavery. That's why they said they were leaving. So they're going to have a new constitution. They didn't change much. They really did not change much in that 1861 constitution. Besides the fact that they said that they were now going to be part of the Confederacy. Now, there were not a lot of Civil War battles fought on Texas soil, but many Texans did fight in the war. And eventually, the Confederate States of America lost the war. So, here you have fought and lost a war. So you have literally lost bodies. You have lost the primary income source for many of at least the elites in the state. And so you are financially devastated. And the United States was not allowing Texas to come back into the Union. So what do? You draft another constitution. So in 1866, after the war ended in 1865, Texas had its, what is this, fourth constitution? According to the book. So we have 1836, 1845, 1861 when they seceded. So 1866, they drafted this constitution that said, okay, slavery's abolished. And we're not gonna be asking you to pay our war debts. We'll take care of those. We are nullifying our secession, so we'd really like to be let back into the United States. But they also, at the same time, were grappling with what is life supposed to look like now. Because you are going to assume that slaves are probably pretty mad. Pretty mad. And you have been taught that these are not people, that these people are not worthy, that you are much better, that their loyalty was hard fought, and that you deserved it. And so at the same time that they passed this constitution or ratified this constitution in 1866, the legislature also passed several laws. Again, this was not unique to Texas. This was going on in many of the states that had seceded. They passed new constitutions and a series of laws designed to gain control and dictate what life was going to look like, primarily for people of color. And you will see here, it has provisions that say, like, a person of color cannot testify except where the prosecution is against a person of color. So you couldn't testify in court by law against someone that was white if you were a person of color. What do we call these laws that were meant to address people of color? We call them black codes. They didn't call them black codes. We started calling them black codes much later. And several states had similar laws. Another provision, you could sign a contract for labor for a period longer than a month, and these contracts would be enforced legally. And I don't know why this tickled me so much. It's really not funny. But once you choose your employer, then you cannot leave employment until the contract is up. And if you do leave that employer, you lose all your wages. And so if you missed a day of work, let me see if I can find it. If you miss a day of work, you don't get paid. If you miss more than 3 days of work, then you could be arrested. There we go. So if the refusal to work continued beyond 3 days, you would be reported to the justice of the peace or the mayor, forced to labor on roads, streets, and other public works without pay until you consented to return to your labor. So you could work for whoever you wanted to, but if you decided that you were going to work for them, you could not leave and you couldn't miss more than 3 days. You could also apprentice your children for extended periods of time to go and work. So you could contract for them. There were a series of what we can stand back today and see very clearly were very discriminatory. This preceded Jim Crow laws. These were the prior to Reconstruction laws, and again we call them black codes. So black codes were written under the Constitution of 1866. The United States government passed the Reconstruction Act in 1867, and it basically said any constitution that you have drafted is void. You're going to have to do a new constitution, and we're going to tell you what has to go in it. Now remember, Texas still had not been admitted to the Union. Texas was not admitted back into the Union until 1870. After they drafted this Constitution basically under duress, because they were just kind of in this no man's land. So the Constitution of 1869 was one that was not very popular. And really the United States government fought around Andrew Johnson and passed these laws, sometimes over his veto, that were designed to, for all intents and purposes, punish the people that had worked in the Confederacy. If you served as an officer in the Confederacy, or had served as if you'd held office, an elected office under the Confederacy, you had to personally get a pardon. You had to go to Washington to get a pardon. And if you had not received your personal pardon, you couldn't vote, you couldn't hold office. They also decided that they were going to separate the southern states into 5 districts, and they had a military command in each of the districts. And so they were really under the foot of United States control. Now, I just read a book by a guy named Ibram X. Kendi, and his theory was that Reconstruction was designed to make life comfortable for African Americans in the South so that they wouldn't migrate to the North. Maybe. It's an interesting theory. At any rate, it was pretty strenuous. It was tough for people that had been in control. They couldn't vote. They couldn't hold office. The laws that were, or the constitutions that were drafted said that there was going to be centralized power in the state, that there was full suffrage, and so that meant that former slaves could vote, and the military protected their right to vote. In addition to that, the Constitution lengthened the chief executive's term to 4 years, where it had been 2. It gave the governor the power to appoint his whole cabinet, to appoint judges. It provided for, instead of once every other year, it provided for a legislative session once a year. the new constitution had a centralized public school system, and under this constitution, the state of Texas, primarily former slaves, elected Governor Edmund James Davis. Now, notice the words that are written on the page. It says that he was an instrument for corrupt and abusive government. That may be true. I cannot find one account of benevolence, goodness, or kindness from E.J. Davis. E.J. Davis had lived in Texas. He did not believe in secession, and he was not a slave owner. And he went and fought with the Union. So he came back home after the war was over. He had not served in the Confederacy. He hadn't held office in the Confederacy. He was definitely qualified under the Constitution to serve. But E.J. Davis detested what Texas had done. And he set about, as much as anything, punishing and putting in place things to retain his own power. He thought that Texas could make some money by attracting railroads, and so he would give generous gifts to railroad companies, trying to get them to come and put their railroads and settle and put headquarters in the state of Texas. And so all of the things that needed to be done, you have a state-run public school system. He said, well, I need the legislature to send me over some new taxes. And they did that. So he signed into law several programs that raised taxes in big ways. And so people are sitting back and their hands are tied because they can't vote, and watching E.J. Davis tax and spend large amounts of money. If you tried to say something bad about E.J. Davis, he went to newspapers and tried to shut down newspapers that said bad things about him. If there were any Democrats, and E.J. Davis, of course, was a Republican, if there were any Democrats that were in the legislature, if they tried not to come to legislative sessions, he would go and have them arrested. So E.J. Davis was not a nice person. He was not very fiscally responsible, but he had a righteous indignation. He didn't trust the Texas Rangers. So he sends the Texas Rangers to West Texas, and he creates a new law enforcement branch that was called the state police. And 40% of the state police, these were people that he trusted, 40% of them were freedmen. They were African American. So they had arms and power, and this just did not sit well. It did not sit well with the people that were used to having power in Texas. Really, from now on, guys, we can relate just about everything that happens. Just about everything that is not right. We can somehow relate it back to the state of Texas's reaction to E.J. Davis. So as the United States government started to get tired, they got tired of the expense of the districts, the expense of the military rule, the resistance of the people that were there, that lived in the states. There was a huge election, and people, of course, had been getting their voting rights back. They'd been getting those pardons. Um, so there was a huge presidential election, and a guy named Rutherford B. Hayes was the Republican candidate, and it was super, super close. Um, and so we were about to have lawsuits, bottom line. So Rutherford B. Hayes sent out representatives to talk to Democrats and basically said, in the South, and basically said, if you will make sure that I am elected, that I can get through this, no lawsuits, that I go ahead and get the position, I promise that we will leave the southern states alone, and you can do what you want to do. We'll take the military out. So some backroom deals were made. Edmund Davis became the president of the United States, and he kept his word. So they pulled the military out. They basically told states that they did not have to keep those forced constitutions, and told them that they could pass whatever laws they wanted to. Now, this was really the beginning of the period that we call the Jim Crow era. And so you have humiliated, angry men that have suddenly been given positions of power, and one of the first things that they're going to do is make sure that E.J. Davis gets voted out. And E.J. Davis tried to hold on to office. He got the Supreme Court, and he had appointed all of the people on the Supreme Court to rule that there had been a violation of the law, so the election results weren't certified. But he had clearly lost to Koch, Democrat. And you should read in the book the account of how they ended up getting E.J. Davis out by taking a mob of people to the State House, and E.J. Davis ended up leaving before his term was even over to basically save his own life.